I just faced a father's worst nightmare. The HOA president herself kicked in my door at dawn with goons, then lunged for my newborn, still sleeping in her crib. And her reason? She had a printed court order she whipped up after wine night. Funny thing is, the only thing truly tested that morning was my self-control not to rearrange her smile. Let me start from the beginning. The first thing I heard wasn't the splintering of the door frame. It was the baby. Our daughter, Lily, all of 3 days old, let out a sharp, piercing cry from the bassinet next to our bed. It was a sound of pure surprise, of a perfect little world shattered. My eyes snapped open. I was on my feet before my brain had even processed the noise that came next. A loud, ugly crack as our front door, the one I'd spent a whole weekend painting a cheerful blue, was kicked clean off its hinges. It slammed against the inside wall with a bang that shook the whole house. My first thought, a stupid primal one, was about the drywall. I'm going to have to patch that. Then the shouting started, and the world caught up. Child Protective Services, we have a warrant. Stay where you are. The voice was female, shrill, and dripping with a kind of smug authority that I knew all too well. I moved instinctively, my body remembering drills my mind had tried to forget. I put myself between the bedroom door and my wife, Sarah. She was sitting bolt upright in bed, clutching the sheets to her chest. Her face, already pale and tired from a C-section just days ago, was a mask of pure terror. The stitches in her belly pulled tight, and I saw a flash of pain cross her features. "Ethan, what is happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. I just held up a hand, a silent command for her to stay put, to stay quiet. I could hear them coming down the hall. Heavy boots on our new hardwood floors. More than one person, a lot more. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted us to hear them. They wanted us to be afraid. And damn it, it was working. My heart was a drum against my ribs, but my hands were steady. My breathing was even. The training takes over. You don't think, you just do. The bedroom door flew open, and there she was, Eleanor Vance, the queen of our little suburban kingdom, the president of the Homeowners Association. She stood there framed in the doorway, a monster wearing a pantsuit. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a perfect, immovable helmet. Her lips were a slash of bright red lipstick pulled back into a triumphant smirk. Behind her stood 3 men, big guys dressed in what looked like cheap, off-brand tactical gear. They wore black vests and helmets with dark visors that hid their faces. They looked less like professional operators and more like a trio of overgrown mall cops who'd won a gift certificate to a military surplus store. One of them was holding a gurney. And to complete the circus, another man stood beside Eleanor, a scrawny weasel holding a professional-looking video camera, its red recording light blinking like a malevolent eye. He was pointing it right at us. "There they are," Eleanor announced, her voice booming with fake concern for the camera. "The unstable father, the incapacitated mother, and the poor, helpless child." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me. "Ethan Hayes, you are a danger to your family. We are here to rescue your daughter." Rescue. The word was so vile, so twisted in her mouth that for a second I couldn't even process it. She held up a piece of paper. "This is a court order signed by a judge. We are taking custody of the child." The man with the camera zoomed in on the paper, then back to my face, then to Sarah, who was now openly sobbing, her hands protectively covering her stomach. Lily, startled by the noise and the fear flooding the room, started wailing a heartbreaking, desperate sound. "You can't do this," Sarah cried out. "She's 3 days old. She needs me." Eleanor ignored her completely. She nodded to her 3 thugs. "Get the baby and bring the mother. She needs a full psychiatric evaluation." 2 of the goons started moving toward the bassinet. The third one, the biggest of the 3, started unfolding the gurney, its metal legs clanking on the floor. That was it. That was the line. My world weariness. The part of me that had seen the worst of humanity and just wanted to be left alone, evaporated. The fire took its place. They were not touching my daughter. They were not touching my wife. My mind went cold and clear. I saw the room not as a bedroom, but as a battle space. I cataloged the threats, the angles, the available weapons. There was a solid oak chair by the window. The lamp on the nightstand had a heavy base. The 2 goons approaching the bassinet were clumsy, off balance. The third one with the gurney was distracted. Eleanor was arrogant, standing too close to the action. "Get away from her," I said. My voice was low, flat. It didn't sound like me. It sounded like someone I used to be. The goons hesitated for a half second. They looked back at Eleanor. She just laughed, a short, ugly bark. Don't listen to him. He's all talk. Get the baby. The first goon reached a hand toward Lily's bassinet. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I saw Sarah's eyes widen in horror. I saw the smug grin on Eleanor's face. I saw the red light of the camera, and I moved. I grabbed the back of the oak chair, spun it around, and swung it hard not at the man's body, but at his head. The solid wood connected with his helmet's visor with a crack like a gunshot. The plastic shattered, and he staggered back, clutching his face, howling in pain. One down. Before the second goon could even react, I was on him. I didn't have a weapon, so I became one. I drove forward, ramming my shoulder into his chest, knocking him off balance. As he stumbled back, I grabbed his right wrist, the one that was reaching for a taser on his belt. I twisted it, bending it back at an angle it wasn't meant to go. Bone ground against bone. He screamed, a high-pitched shriek of agony, and dropped to his knees. His weapon clattered to the floor. The third goon, the one with the gurney, finally realized what was happening and charged at me. He was big but slow. I sidestepped his clumsy bull rush, stuck out my foot, and sent him sprawling face first onto the carpet. He went down with a heavy thud that probably shook the foundation. It took less than 5 seconds. 3 goons neutralized. Eleanor's smile had vanished, replaced by a look of shocked disbelief. The cameraman was frozen, his lens still pointed at the scene, capturing every beautiful moment of my little rampage. I stood there breathing heavily, my knuckles raw. I kicked the taser away from the kneeling man and turned my attention to Eleanor. Get out of my house, I snarled. But just then, I heard the sirens. Not in the distance, they were right outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the window, painting the walls in strobing colors. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies appeared in the bedroom doorway, guns drawn. Drop to your knees. Hands behind your head. Now, they shouted. My heart sank. Of course, Eleanor, the master manipulator, had planned for this. She had called them beforehand, told them I was violent, that I would resist. To them, I was the bad guy. I had just assaulted 3 men who were, as far as they knew, legitimate officers of the court. I glanced at Sarah. She was staring at the deputies, her face a mess of tears and confusion. I had no choice. I slowly lowered myself to my knees and placed my hands behind my head. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into my wrists. As they hauled me to my feet, Eleanor's smirk returned, wider and more venomous than ever. See, she said to the deputies, her voice dripping with false concern. Violent. Unstable. Exactly like I told you. Now, please secure the child before he hurts someone else. They started to move Sarah, still in her hospital gown, onto that awful gurney. They were going to take her. They were going to take my baby. The goons wheeled Sarah's gurney down the hall and burst onto the front walk, Eleanor clawing at Lily, the cameraman jogging beside for the money shot. Right then, the navy-vested stack fanned out from the convoy. A flashbang popped, and the driveway erupted in controlled chaos. I was helpless in cuffs, watching my worst nightmare unfold. But what Eleanor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my defense had started long before they ever kicked in that door. Every camera on my property, from the doorbell to the ones hidden in the eaves, wasn't just recording to a local drive. It was streaming in real time to a secure Cervera server monitored by a few old friends of mine. The kind of friends who don't just call the police. They are the police. The very best kind. And I knew, even as they were pushing me out of my own house, that help was already on the way. Everything that happened that morning, the door, the goons, the fight, it wasn't the start of something. It was the end of a long, miserable road. A road that began about a year earlier when Sarah and I first laid eyes on this house. It was perfect. A little 2-bedroom bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood called Oakwood Creek. It had a big backyard for a dog we planned to get, and a spare room that we dreamed would one day be a nursery. It was supposed to be our forever home, the place where we could finally put down roots. After years of moving from one military base to another, all I wanted was peace. I wanted to wake up in the same bed every morning. I wanted to know my neighbors. I wanted a life so boring that the most exciting part of my week was deciding what to grill on Saturday. Sarah wanted the same thing. She deserved it. She had followed me across the country and around the world, never complaining, always making a home for us wherever the Navy sent me. This house was my gift to her, a promise of a normal, quiet life. We closed on the house in the spring. The first few weeks were bliss. We painted rooms, planted flowers, and met some of the neighbors. There was the elderly couple across the street, the young family with toddlers next door, and then there was neighbor Walter. He lived 2 doors down. Walter was a widower in his late 70s, a retired postal worker with a twinkle in his eye and a story for every occasion. He was the first one to welcome us, showing up on our second day with a plate of brownies and a wealth of unsolicited but hilarious advice about lawn care. "Don't let the dandelions get a foothold," he'd warned, pointing a bony finger at a patch of yellow weeds. "They're like tiny little invaders. They look innocent, but they're planning a takeover." We liked Walter immediately. He was the quirky, grandfatherly figure every neighborhood should have. He was also the first one to warn us about Eleanor Vance. "She's the queen bee of the HOA," he told us one afternoon while I was struggling with a new lawn mower. "And she takes the queen part very seriously." He explained that Eleanor had been the president of the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association for almost 20 years. Her husband was a high-powered attorney, and they lived in the biggest house on the block, a sprawling McMansion that looked down on the rest of us. According to Walter, Eleanor treated the neighborhood like her own personal fiefdom. "She's got a rule for everything," he'd said, shaking his head. "The color of your mailbox, the type of flowers you can plant, the maximum allowable height of your grass. She measures with a ruler." I laughed it off at the time. I'd dealt with my share of petty tyrants and bureaucrats in the military. How bad could one woman with a clipboard and too much time on her hands really be? I found out a week later. We got our first official notice. It was a crisp, white envelope left tucked under our doormat. Inside, on thick, embossed letterhead, was a formal violation warning. Our crime. The garden gnome Sarah's grandmother had given us as a housewarming gift. Apparently, it was an unapproved lawn ornament. According to Section C, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws, all lawn decorations had to be submitted for approval to the Architectural Review Committee, a committee that consisted of, you guessed it, Eleanor Vance. We were given 48 hours to remove the offending gnome or face a $50 fine. I was furious. Sarah, ever the peacemaker, just sighed. "It's silly, but let's just move him to the backyard," she said. "It's not worth fighting over." I reluctantly agreed, but it left a sour taste in my mouth. This wasn't about maintaining neighborhood standards. This was about power. The gnome was just the beginning. Over the next few months, the violations piled up. We got a fine because our garbage can was visible from the street for 2 hours after the trash had been collected. We got a warning because the brand of mulch we used in our flower beds wasn't on the approved list. I tried to talk to her once at the annual HOA barbecue. I approached her with a smile, hoping to find some common ground. "Eleanor," I started, "I think there might be a misunderstanding about some of these notices." She didn't even let me finish. She looked me up and down, her eyes cold and dismissive. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice like ice. "The rules are the rules. They apply to everyone. Perhaps if you spent less time questioning them and more time following them, we wouldn't have a problem." Then she turned her back on me and walked away. It was clear she wasn't interested in reason. She was a bully who got a thrill from making other people miserable. Walter confirmed as much. He told me stories of other families she had targeted, harassing them with fines and threats until they finally gave up and moved away. "She likes to pick one family every few years and make an example of them," he explained grimly. "Looks like you're this year's lucky winner." The final straw came when Sarah got pregnant. We were overjoyed. After years of trying, we were finally going to have a family. But the stress from Eleanor's constant harassment was taking a toll on Sarah. Her blood pressure was high. Her doctor told her she needed to avoid stress. But how could she, when every time she looked out the window, she was afraid she'd see Eleanor Vance prowling around our yard with a ruler and a notepad? I knew I had to do something. The petty tyranny was one thing, but when it started to affect the health of my wife and my unborn child, the game changed. I thought her cruelty was just a personality flaw, a product of boredom and entitlement. I had no idea it was all part of a much bigger, much more sinister plan. I didn't know that our little dream house, the place we'd chosen for its peace and quiet, was standing directly in the way of her greed. The war truly began on a crisp autumn afternoon. The leaves were turning, and the air had that perfect cool edge to it. Sarah was about 6 months pregnant, and she was finally starting to relax a little. We'd had a few weeks of quiet from Eleanor, and we were foolish enough to think she might have moved on to a new target. We were sitting on the porch swing, talking about baby names, when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was carrying a leather briefcase and had the kind of polished, predatory smile that you only see on sharks and real estate developers. He walked right up our front path and introduced himself as Mr. Sterling. He said he represented a development firm that was very interested in our property. "We're prepared to make you a very generous offer," he said, opening his briefcase and producing a folder. He handed it to me. I opened it. The generous offer was barely more than what we had paid for the house 6 months earlier. It didn't account for the improvements we'd made, the hot real estate market, or the fact that we had absolutely no desire to sell. It was a lowball offer, plain and simple. An insulting one. I looked at Sarah. Her brow was furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry," I said, handing the folder back to the man. "But we're not interested. This is our home. We're planning on starting our family here." Mr. Sterling's smile didn't falter, but his eyes got colder. "Perhaps you should reconsider," he said smoothly. "It's a very strong offer, and I should mention that your neighbor, Mrs. Vance, is very supportive of our project. She believes it will be a great benefit to the community." And there it was. The puppet master pulling the strings. This wasn't some random developer. This was Eleanor's play. "I'm sure she does," I said, my voice tight. "But the answer is no. We're not selling." The man's smile finally vanished. He snapped his briefcase shut. "A pity," he said. "I think you'll come to regret that decision." He turned and walked back to his car without another word. As he drove away, I saw a curtain twitch in the window of Eleanor's house across the street. She had been watching the whole time. The quiet was over. The very next day, the floodgates opened. We received 3 violation notices in a single morning. One was for a small crack in the driveway that had been there when we bought the house. The fine was $200. Another was for improperly stored recreational equipment, because our porch swing was apparently not a sanctioned form of seating. That was another $100. The third was the most absurd of all. It was a warning that the color we had painted the nursery, a soft, pale yellow, was visible from the street and was not on the pre-approved palette of interior colors. I completely lost it. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a targeted campaign to make our lives so miserable that we would be forced to sell. I stormed out of the house, the notices clutched in my fist, and marched straight across the street to her house. I didn't even bother with the doorbell. I hammered on her door with my fist. She opened it a few seconds later, a look of feigned surprise on her face. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I held up the crumpled papers. "You know exactly what this is about, Eleanor," I spat. "This has to stop. You are harassing my pregnant wife. You are trying to force us out of our home. It's over." She just smiled, a cold, empty thing that didn't reach her eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said calmly. "I am simply enforcing the bylaws of this community, which you agreed to when you purchased your home. If you have a problem with the rules, perhaps you chose the wrong neighborhood." My blood was boiling. I was so angry I could barely speak. I wanted to scream, to break something, to wipe that smug look right off her face. But I looked past her, into her perfect, sterile house, and I saw the fear in my own reflection in the glass of her storm door. That's what she wanted. She wanted me to lose control. She wanted me to get violent, to give her ammunition to use against me. My methodical side, the part of me that had been trained to assess a situation before acting, took over. I took a deep breath, forcing the rage down. "This isn't over," I said, my voice low and steady. "You've picked a fight with the wrong person." Her smile widened just a fraction. It was the look of a predator who knows it has its prey trapped. "Oh, I don't think so," she said softly. "Some people just don't know what's good for them. But they always learn, one way or another." She closed the door in my face. I stood there on her porch for a long moment, the quiet hum of the neighborhood mocking me. I had walked right into her trap, shown her my anger, and let her know she was getting to me. As I walked back to my own house, I saw neighbor Walter tending to his rose bushes. He looked up and gave me a grim, knowing look. He didn't have to say anything. We both knew what that little confrontation meant. I had just declared war, and I had the sinking feeling that Eleanor Vance was a far more experienced soldier in this kind of fight than I was. I just didn't realize how dirty her tactics were about to get, or how far she was willing to go to win. After that confrontation on her porch, Eleanor's campaign of terror escalated from a nuisance to a full-blown psychological assault. It was clear that she wasn't just trying to annoy us into selling anymore. She was trying to break us. The violation notices became a daily occurrence, each one more ridiculous than the last. A fine for leaving a watering can on the lawn for an hour. A citation because a single shingle on the roof looked misaligned from the street. A formal complaint about excessive noise when I was mowing the lawn on a Saturday afternoon. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, and it was working. Sarah was a wreck. Every time the mail arrived, her shoulders would tense up. She stopped wanting to go for walks in the neighborhood, afraid of running into Eleanor. Our dream home had become a prison. I knew I couldn't fight her on her terms. The HOA was her kingdom, and the bylaws were her Bible, a text she could interpret however she wanted. Arguing with her was like arguing with a brick wall, so I started to fight her on my terms. My methodical, military mind took over. I began to document everything. I bought a special ledger and logged every single notice, every fine, every interaction. I took pictures, dated and time-stamped, of our violations, the perfectly aligned shingles, the watering can that was gone an hour later. I created a file, a dossier of her harassment that grew thicker by the day. And then I took the most important step. I upgraded our home security. I told Sarah it was for the baby. With a newborn in the house, you can never be too careful, I said. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I installed a top-of-the-line system with high-definition cameras covering every inch of our property. The doorbell, the garage, the front porch, the backyard, the side of the house. I even installed a few tiny, nearly invisible cameras in the eaves, pointing directly at the street with a perfect view of Eleanor's house. But the real genius of the system wasn't the cameras themselves. It was where the footage went. I configured the system to bypass a local hard drive and stream everything directly to a secure, encrypted cloud server. It was the kind of setup we used for remote surveillance overseas. Overkill for a suburban home? Absolutely. But I had a feeling it would be worth it. Neighbor Walter became my unofficial intelligence source. He'd wander over while I was doing yard work, always with a cup of coffee and a new piece of information. Saw Eleanor's husband meeting with that developer fella again last night, he'd say, peering over his glasses. They had blueprints spread out on the hood of his car. He told me stories about other families she had targeted, people who had been financially ruined by her endless fines and the legal fees it took to fight them. He told me about a retired teacher who had to take out a second mortgage to pay off the thousands of dollars in fines Eleanor had levied against her for having unapproved wind chimes. She's a shark that smells blood in the water, Walter said, his usual witty tone gone, replaced by a grim seriousness. Be careful, son. She doesn't just want to win. She wants to destroy. I'd always wondered how the old man seemed to know HOA gossip before it happened. His warnings echoed in my head as Sarah's due date approached. The stress was immense. We were trying to prepare for the most joyful event of our lives, but it was all happening under the shadow of Eleanor's relentless persecution. Sarah's doctor was concerned. Her blood pressure was still too high. There was talk of inducing labor early. Every day was a battle to keep Sarah calm, to reassure her that everything would be okay, that I would handle it. But inside, I was terrified. I felt like I was failing her. I had promised her a peaceful life, and instead, I had led her into a war zone. Then one night, it happened. Sarah's water broke. We rushed to the hospital in a blur of panic and excitement. All the stress, all the fear about Eleanor, and the house side all melted away. The only thing that mattered was bringing our daughter safely into the world. After 18 brutal hours of stalled labor, the doctors wheeled Sarah in for an emergency C-section, and Lily finally arrived. She was perfect tiny, with a full head of dark hair and my nose. Holding her for the first time, I felt a love so fierce, so protective, it was like a physical force. This little girl was my world, and I would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect her. We spent 2 days in the hospital, cocooned in that peaceful, sterile bubble. It felt a world away from Oakwood Creek and its petty tyrant. For those 48 hours, we were just a normal, happy family. When it was time to go home, I was filled with a mix of joy and dread. I couldn't wait to bring our daughter to her home, to lay her in the beautiful crib we had so carefully assembled. But part of me was terrified of re-entering the battlefield. As we pulled into our driveway, I scanned the street. Everything was quiet. Eleanor's house was still. There were no new notices on our door. I allowed myself a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the birth of our child would be a ceasefire. Maybe even Eleanor had enough humanity to leave a family with a newborn baby alone. We carried Lily inside, our hearts full, believing that the worst was finally behind us. That was our first and most dangerous mistake. We didn't understand that for Eleanor, our greatest joy was her greatest opportunity. Her silence wasn't a truce. It was the final, quiet moment before she launched her most vicious attack. The aftermath of the raid was a chaotic blur. 1 minute I was in handcuffs watching my life fall apart, and the next, the cavalry had arrived. A black, unmarked van, and 2 county SWAT trucks manned this month by Mark's Reserve SEAL instructor screeched to a halt. They weren't ordinary cops. Mark's unit were Reserve SEAL instructors on loan to county SWAT. Their matte black vests, stamped in bold yellow navy, gleamed under the floodlights. These guys weren't cheap imitations. They were the real deal. They moved with a fluid, terrifying efficiency that I knew well. They stacked up on my broken front door. A flashbang grenade went off with a deafening boom and a blinding light, and they flooded into the house. It was over in seconds. The deputies who had arrested me were stunned into inaction. Eleanor's remaining goon, the one with the gurney, was on the ground with a knee in his back before he could even blink. My old platoon mate, Sergeant Mark Sullivan, now the head of the county's SWAT team, ripped the phony warrant out of a bewildered deputy's hand. He took one look at it, and then at Eleanor. "This is a forgery," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He pulled out his phone and showed it to the senior deputy on the scene. "And this is a live feed from the cameras on this house. We have video of you kicking in the door. We have audio of you admitting there's no legitimate CPS case. We also have bank transfers showing a payment from your husband's development company to this CPS agent's personal account." He pointed at the weaselly man who had been holding the camera, who now looked like he was about to be sick. The world turned right side up again. The cuffs came off my wrists and were promptly slapped onto Eleanor's. She didn't scream or protest. She just stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her husband, who had apparently been waiting in his car down the street, was arrested when he came to see what the commotion was about. The goons and the fake CPS agent were all taken into custody. An ambulance arrived. Paramedics finally rolled Sarah and Lily to a real ambulance, in the same driveway where the Navy stack took Eleanor down. Sarah was shaken and terrified, but she was safe. Lily was safe. As I watched the paddy wagon pull away with Eleanor and her whole crew inside, I felt a surge of triumph. We won. We had beaten her. But that victory was short-lived. The very next day, I got a call from Mark. "You're not going to like this," he said. "She's out." I couldn't believe it. Out? How? "She's facing kidnapping, fraud, assault." Mark sighed. The DA's office kept stalling. Word was Eleanor owned him, though I didn't yet know how. Her husband's law firm posted a 7-figure bond like it was pocket change. And the DA's office. They're dragging their feet. They're talking about this as a complex civil dispute that got out of hand. They're treating her with kid gloves. My blood ran cold. Of course, her husband wasn't just some lawyer. He was a major player in the city. They had money, connections, power, the kind of power that makes felony charges disappear. Then the second part of her attack began. It was no longer about HOA notices or even physical intimidation. It was a war for public opinion. A local news blog, one known for sensationalism and questionable ethics, posted an article titled, "Local Hero HOA President Attacked by Unstable Veteran." It was filled with quotes from anonymous neighbors who described me as aggressive and threatening. It painted Eleanor as a concerned community leader who was only trying to protect a helpless child from a dangerous father and a mentally fragile mother. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, filled with lies and half-truths. My military service was twisted to make me sound like a ticking time bomb. Sarah's very normal postpartum exhaustion was spun into a narrative of severe mental illness. The story spread like wildfire on social media. Our names and pictures were everywhere. People who didn't know us, who didn't know the first thing about the situation, were leaving vile comments, calling me a monster and Sarah an unfit mother. Our friends and family started getting calls from reporters. Even Sarah's mom, who lived 3 states away, saw the story. It was a nightmare. We had won the physical battle in our bedroom, but we were losing the war for our reputations, for our peace of mind. Eleanor was no longer just a neighborhood bully. She was a media-savvy monster with a team of expensive lawyers and public relations experts. She was turning herself into the victim and me into the villain. I felt a kind of despair I hadn't felt since the darkest days of my deployments. I had faced enemies with guns and bombs, but I had no idea how to fight an enemy armed with lies and innuendo. The legal system, the very thing that was supposed to protect us, was being manipulated against us. The initial triumph of seeing her in handcuffs curdled into a sickening realization. She was going to get away with it. She was going to destroy our lives. And she would do it all with a smile on her face, wrapped in the protective blanket of her wealth and influence. I looked at Sarah, who was trying to breastfeed Lily but was shaking too hard to do it. I looked at our daughter, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the storm raging around her. The protective fire in my gut roared back to life, hotter than ever. If the law couldn't give us justice, then the law was no longer the answer. I couldn't just defend my family anymore. I had to go on the offensive, and I knew my fight wouldn't be won with evidence and testimony. It would be won with secrets and shadows. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my life. The legal system was failing us. The media was crucifying us. Sarah was a ghost in our own home, afraid to answer the phone, afraid to look at the internet. She would just sit for hours holding Lily, rocking back and forth, her eyes empty. One evening, she finally broke down. "We have to move, Ethan," she sobbed, her body trembling. "We have to sell the house and just go. Go somewhere she can never find us. It's not worth it. She's going to destroy us." I held her, my heart breaking for her. Part of me, the part that was world-weary and just wanted peace, agreed with her. Running seemed like the only sane option. We could disappear, start over, and leave the monster of Oakwood Creek behind. But another part of me, the fiery, protective part, knew that wasn't an answer. It was a surrender. If we ran, Eleanor would win. She would get our house. She would get her condo development. And she would move on to terrorize the next family that stood in her way. And what kind of life would we have? Always looking over our shoulders, living in fear. What kind of lesson would that teach our daughter? That when you're faced with a bully, you run and hide? No, I couldn't accept that. This was my home. This was my family, and I would go to any length to defend it. This was the crossroads. Do I stick to the rules of a game that's rigged against me? Or do I start playing by my own rules? That night, after Sarah and the baby were asleep, I went for a walk. I ended up in front of neighbor Walter's house. His lights were still on. I saw him through the window, sitting in an old armchair, staring at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked on his door. He opened it and ushered me in without a word. He poured me a glass of whiskey, and we sat in silence for a few minutes. "She's going to get away with it, isn't she?" I finally said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Walter took a long sip of his own drink. He looked over at the photograph on the mantel. It was of a young man with a wide, hopeful smile. "That's my son," Walter said, his voice thick with an old, deep sorrow. "Thomas. He was a good boy, a smart boy. Started his own landscaping business right out of high school. Built it from the ground up." He paused, his eyes lost in the past. "He got the contract for the common areas in this neighborhood. He was so proud. But he made one mistake. He underbid Eleanor's preferred contractor, a cousin of hers. She never forgave him for that." Walter went on to tell me a story that was chillingly familiar. It started with petty complaints. Fines for parking his work truck on the street for 10 minutes too long. Citations for his crew starting 5 minutes too early. Then she started withholding payments from the HOA, claiming his work wasn't up to her standards. She buried him in paperwork, in legal threats. She bled his small business dry. He lost everything, Walter said, his voice cracking. The business, his house, his savings. He ended up declaring bankruptcy. The shame of it. It was too much for him. Walter pointed a shaky finger at the picture. That was taken a week before he took his own life. In the letter he left, he wrote her name, Eleanor Vance. He said she was a poison that had seeped into every part of his life until there was nothing good left. I stared at Walter, horrified. This wasn't just about greed or power for Eleanor. This was a pattern of deliberate, malicious destruction. She wasn't just a bully. She was a killer. All my hesitation, all my doubts about what I had to do, they vanished in that moment. My moral crossroads had become a straight, clear path. "I'm sorry, Walter," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry." He just shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "Don't be sorry," he said, his voice gaining a new, hard edge. "Be angry. Be smart. Don't let her do to you what she did to my boy. You have a family to protect. You fight her with everything you have. You hear me? Everything." I nodded, a cold resolve settling deep in my bones. I finished my whiskey in one gulp, the burn in my throat nothing compared to the fire in my chest. I knew what I had to do. The law wouldn't help. Reason wouldn't help. The only thing a monster like Eleanor Vance would understand was having her own world burned down around her. I went home and walked into my office. I sat down at my desk and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through the contacts to a name I hadn't called in years, a name associated with a part of my life I had tried to leave behind. A life of shadows, secrets, and morally gray areas. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "It's been a while," a gravelly voice on the other end said. "Yeah, it's me," I replied. "I need a favor." The kind of favor we don't talk about on an open line. There was a pause. Then, I thought you were out of the game. I looked over at the baby monitor on my desk, at the image of Lily sleeping peacefully in her crib. They pulled me back in, I said. And this time, it's personal. The phone call was the first domino. My friend on the other end, a man known only as Ghost in our old circles, was a master of digital warfare. He didn't ask many questions. He just said, "Tell me what you need." And I did. I told him everything about Eleanor, her husband, the phony development company, the harassment, the attempted kidnapping. I sent him my entire dossier, the logs, the photos, the videos from my security cameras. He went to work immediately, and he wasn't alone. He pulled in a few other members of our old unit, guys with specialties in financial tracking, asset location, and what they euphemistically called social engineering. While they started their digital deep dive, I focused on the ground game. My first target was the HOA's finances. As a homeowner, I was legally entitled to review them. I sent a formal registered letter to the HOA board, which was really just Eleanor and two of her cronies requesting a full audit. The panic was immediate. I got a blustering letter back from her husband's law firm telling me my request was improper and burdensome. That was all the confirmation I needed. They were hiding something. While they were stonewalling me, Ghost's team was already inside their servers. They didn't bother with the front door. They slipped in through the back. What they found was staggering. For years, Eleanor had been using the HOA as her personal slush fund. HOA fees were being funneled into a shell corporation under her maiden name. She was using community money to pay for her landscaping, her pool cleaning, even her property taxes. She had been embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The real dirt was connected to her husband and his development company. It turned out the company was a front, a money laundering operation for some very unsavory clients involved in organized crime. The condo project they wanted to build on our land wasn't just about real estate. It was about washing millions of dollars in dirty money. Our little house was standing in the way of a massive criminal enterprise. The attempted kidnapping of our daughter suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. It wasn't just a desperate act of a petty tyrant. It was a calculated business move. If they could get us declared unstable and unfit, they could get control of our property through the courts and clear the way for their project. The information poured in, a torrent of digital evidence. Offshore bank accounts, encrypted emails, dummy corporations. It was a complex web of deceit and criminality, all orchestrated by Eleanor and her husband. But we also discovered something else, her leverage. Eleanor wasn't just powerful because of her husband's money. She was a master blackmailer. Ghost's team found a hidden, encrypted folder on her personal computer labeled insurance. Inside was a collection of files containing dirt on nearly every person of influence in the city, a city councilman's gambling debts, a building inspector's affair, a judge's hidden addiction. She had been collecting secrets for years, using them to bend the city's officials to her will. This was how she operated with such impunity. She wasn't just greasing palms. She had a gun to everyone's head. We had at a mountain of evidence that could not only send Eleanor and her husband to prison for the rest of their lives, but could also dismantle a citywide network of corruption. The question was what to do with it. We couldn't just hand it over to the local police or the DA. Eleanor had them in her pocket. They would bury it, and we would be exposed. We needed a plan, a way to detonate all this information at once in a way that no one could cover up. We decided on a three-pronged attack. First, we would package the financial crimes, the embezzlement, the tax evasion, the money laundering, and send it anonymously to the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division. They were federal, and they couldn't be intimidated by local politics. Second, we would leak the salacious blackmail material to the same muckraking news blogger who had smeared my name. Let him tear down the very people he had been protecting. It was poetic justice. Third, and most importantly, we would use the evidence of the kidnapping and the criminal enterprise to get the attention of the FBI. It was a risky plan. We had to move carefully, covering our digital tracks at every step. One wrong move, and Eleanor would know we were coming for her. For a week, my office became a command center. I barely slept, fueled by coffee and a burning need for revenge. Sarah knew something was happening. She saw the light under my office door at all hours of the night. She saw the dark circles under my eyes. But she didn't ask questions. She just looked at me with a new expression in her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else, a fragile, tentative hope. She knew I was fighting back. The fuse was built. The evidence was packaged and ready to go. All we had to do was light it. I felt a grim satisfaction settling over me. The storm was coming for Eleanor Vance, and she had no idea she was standing in the middle of a hurricane. We were hours away from launching our digital assault. The packages of data were encrypted, loaded onto anonymous servers, and timed to release simultaneously to the IRS, the FBI, and the sleaziest journalist in the state. It was a perfect plan, a clean, modern, remote-controlled demolition of Eleanor Vance's entire world. I was sitting in my office, running through the final checklist, when I heard a soft knock on the front door. It was late. My first thought was that Eleanor had sent more goons. I checked the camera feed. It was neighbor Walter. He was standing on my porch, twisting a worn hat in his hands, his face pale and drawn. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. I let him in. He didn't say a word, just walked into my living room and sank into an armchair, his movements stiff and uncertain. "Walter, what is it? What's wrong?" I asked, my mind racing. Had Eleanor done something? Had she found out about our plan? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a conflict I couldn't decipher. "I have to tell you something, Ethan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I haven't been completely honest with you." My stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" He took a deep, shuddering breath. "My guidance. The things I told you about looking into the HOA's books, about her husband's business. It wasn't just random neighborly advice. I have been pushing you, gently, guiding you toward the things I already knew." I stared at him, confused. "What did you know?" Walter's story came tumbling out, a confession that had clearly been weighing on him for years. His son's suicide had broken him, but it had also forged him into something else, a patient, methodical seeker of vengeance. For nearly a decade, Walter had been playing a long, quiet game. He had dedicated his life to gathering information on Eleanor Vance. He'd spent his retirement learning about public records, about tracking corporate filings, about digging into people's pasts. He had been slowly, painstakingly assembling a case against her, piece by piece. But he was just an old man. He had the information, but he lacked the resources, the skills, the muscle to do anything with it. He was a general with an army of one. "Then you moved in," he said, looking at me. "I saw the way you carried yourself. I heard from another neighbor you were former military. I saw the way you stood up to her, the fire in your eyes. I knew you were the ally I had been waiting for." I was stunned. The quirky, comic relief neighbor was actually a secret spy master who had been subtly manipulating me from the very beginning. But that wasn't the big twist. That wasn't the bomb he was about to drop. "All your digital stuff, your hacking. It's good," he said. "But you missed something. Something she would never keep on a computer. Something she thinks no one else in the world knows about." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound book. It looked like an old diary. He handed it to me. "What is this?" I asked, my fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. "That," Walter said, his voice grim, "is the family Bible." He explained that Eleanor's father had been the HOA president before her. He had been the one to build their little empire of corruption, and he had taught his daughter everything he knew. That book was his handwritten ledger. Decades of extortion, blackmail, and illegal deals, all meticulously recorded in a spidery script. It was a detailed history of their family's crimes. I started flipping through the pages, my eyes widening at the names and figures. It was a roadmap to half a century of rotten decay in our town. But then I saw a name that made my blood run cold. It was the name of our current district attorney. And next to his name were details of a hush money payment made decades ago, a payment to cover up a hit-and-run accident committed by the DA's own father. An accident that had crippled a child. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The reason Eleanor got out on bail so easily. The reason the DA was dragging his feet on her kidnapping charges. It wasn't just about money and influence. It was direct, personal blackmail. Eleanor was holding the DA's entire career, his entire family legacy, hostage. He wasn't just a friendly prosecutor. He was her puppet. Our plan to go to the local authorities was not just flawed. It was a death trap. If we gave this information to the DA's office, he would bury it to save himself, and he would alert Eleanor that we were coming. We would be exposed, and she would be untouchable, protected by the very man who was supposed to prosecute her. I looked from the ledger in my hands to Walter. His face was a mixture of grief and grim triumph. He had just handed me the murder weapon, the one piece of evidence that tied everything together and explained everything we were up against. Our carefully constructed plan was now useless. We were fighting a monster, but we had just discovered that the monster owned the zookeeper. We couldn't go to the local police. We couldn't go to the state police, who often worked with the DA's office. There was only one option left. We had to go over everyone's head. We had to get this ledger, this smoking gun, into the hands of the feds. And we had to do it without anyone in the state knowing what we were up to. The game had just gotten infinitely more dangerous. The discovery of the ledger changed everything. I killed the timers on the IRS and blog drops. Those payloads would stay dark until the Bureau had every hard copy in hand. Our multi-pronged digital attack was now a single, high-stakes gambit. We had to get the physical ledger and a hard drive containing all our other evidence into the hands of the FBI. But we had to bypass every local and state channel to do it. The risk of the DA getting tipped off was too great. Ghost, my digital phantom, came through again. He had a contact, a former colleague from his own shadowy past, who now worked in the FBI's Public Integrity Section in Washington, D.C. It was a long shot, but it was our only shot. We had to set up a meeting, a direct handoff, no middlemen. But first, I needed to make sure Eleanor stayed put. I needed to pin her in place long enough for the feds to get here. I needed a showdown. This is where the devious part of me kicked into high gear. I had to set a trap, and I had to use the perfect bait, her own ego. I had my Liera guy I trusted from my military days, not some local hack in Eleanor's pocket draft a settlement offer. It was the most humiliating, groveling document you can imagine. It said that I, Ethan Hayes, was mentally unstable from my time in combat. It said I had overreacted. It offered a full public apology to her. And in exchange for her dropping all complaints and signing a non-disclosure agreement, I would sell her our house for the original, insulting price her developer had offered. It was a total, unconditional surrender. It was everything she had ever wanted. To any sane person, it would have looked too good to be true. But Eleanor Vance wasn't sane. She was an egomaniac. The idea of me crawling back to her, broken and defeated, was a temptation she could never resist. Her husband, the lawyer, was smarter. He was suspicious. But Eleanor, blinded by her arrogance, overruled him. She agreed to a meeting. She insisted it be on her turf, the HOA Community Center. She wanted an audience for her final victory. It was perfect. While this was happening, I moved my own pieces into place. Sarah and Lily were on a plane to my parents' house in another state. They were safe, far away from the blast radius. Neighbor Walter was my eyes and ears, coordinating with a small team from a vantage point in his house across the street. And Ghost was on a secure line with his contact at the FBI, feeding them real-time updates. The feds were already on a plane. The trap was set. The night of the meeting was cold and rainy. The community center, a sterile, soulless building used for potlucks and HOA meetings, felt like a mausoleum. I walked in alone. Eleanor was there, sitting at the head of a long table, looking like a queen holding court. Her husband stood behind her, his arms crossed, his face a mask of suspicion. And of course, she had brought two new goons, big, dumb-looking guys in cheap suits who stood by the door. She had the documents laid out on the table in front of her. Well, Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. I knew you'd see reason eventually. It's a shame you had to put your poor family through so much trouble first. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, letting her gloat. This was the most critical part of the plan. I was wearing a wire, a tiny microphone feeding a live signal to the FBI team that was now sitting in a van just down the street. I needed her to talk. I needed her to confess. So, you sign the papers, transfer the title, she continued, tapping a manicured finger on the stack. And I'll make a call to my good friend, the district attorney. I'll tell him you've had a moment of clarity. Maybe the charges just disappear. It's amazing what a little cooperation can do. I had to give her a little push. How can you be so sure? I asked, my voice feigning defeat. How do you know he'll listen? Eleanor laughed, a loud, ugly, triumphant sound that echoed in the empty room. Oh, honey, she said, leaning forward conspiratorially. He always listens. People always listen when you know their secrets. Just ask his father. Or ask that pathetic old fool, Walter. His son learned what happens when you don't listen. My blood ran cold hearing her speak so callously about Thomas's death, but I held my ground. I needed more. And the development? This is all for some condos. I asked. Her husband shot her a warning look, but she was too high on her own power to care. The condos are just the beginning, she bragged. They're a washing machine, Mr. Hayes. A beautiful, high-end machine for making dirty money clean. And your little patch of dirt was the last piece of the puzzle. She had admitted to everything: extortion, blackmail, conspiracy, money laundering. It was all on tape. Just as she pushed the papers toward me, a pen in her hand, the double doors of the community center burst open. But it wasn't a loud, chaotic SWAT raid this time. It was quiet, professional. A half-dozen men and women in dark blue jackets with 3 gold letters on the back FBI filled into the room. They moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that was far more terrifying than any shouting. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel gray eyes, walked right past me. She didn't even look at the goons, who had frozen in place. Her eyes were locked on Eleanor. "Eleanor Vance," the agent said, her voice calm and clear. "You are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and extortion." She nodded to another agent, who stepped forward and snapped handcuffs onto Eleanor's wrists. The look of triumph on Eleanor's face melted away, replaced by pure, slack-jawed shock. The agent then turned to the husband. "And you, Mr. Vance, you're under arrest for money laundering and bribery. We have a warrant to seize every file in your entire law firm." As they were cuffed, the whole room was silent except for the sound of the rain against the windows. It was clean. It was precise. It was final. Across the street, through the large windows, I could see a light flick on and off in Walter's house. The signal. I looked back at Eleanor as they were leading her out. She turned and stared at me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, black hatred. It was the look of someone who had been utterly and completely beaten but would never, ever surrender. It was the look of a monster who, even in a cage, would still be a monster. The battle was over. The war was won. But looking into those eyes, I had to wonder, was it truly, finally over? 6 months later, I'm sitting on my front porch swing, the one Eleanor once tried to find me for. The afternoon sun is warm, and a gentle breeze rustles the leaves in the big oak tree on our lawn. The air is filled with the sound of children laughing down the street and the distant hum of a lawnmower. It's the sound of peace, the sound of normal. In my arms, I'm gently rocking my daughter, Lily. She's grown so much. She has Sarah's bright blue eyes, and she's just started smiling these big, gummy grins that make my heart ache with love. The house is ours, the title free and clear. The cloud that hung over it for so long is gone, burned away by the harsh light of justice. Eleanor and her husband were denied bail. The evidence, especially her father's ledger and her taped confession, was overwhelming. The federal case against them is a behemoth, a sprawling indictment of racketeering, money laundering, and a dozen other felonies that will keep them in courtrooms and then prison cell for the rest of their lives. The DA was forced to resign in disgrace, and the FBI's public corruption investigation cleaned out half of the city government. The whole rotten structure that Eleanor had built her power on came crashing down. The HOA was dissolved by a court order. For a few months, there was chaos. But then, something amazing happened. The neighbors, free from Eleanor's reign of terror for the first time in decades, started talking to each other. They organized. They formed a new, voluntary neighborhood association with simple, common-sense rules. Neighbor Walter is the interim president. His first official act was to tear down the old community center and, with funds donated by the families Eleanor had victimized, build a beautiful community garden in its place. In the center of the garden, there's a simple stone bench with a small brass plaque. It reads, "In memory of Thomas and all those who deserved a better neighbor." Sarah comes out of the house, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She hands one to me and puts her hand on my shoulder. She's smiling again. Not the tense, fragile smile she wore for months, but a real one that reaches her eyes. She's been going to therapy, working through the trauma, and every day a little more of the old, carefree Sarah comes back. "It's quiet," she says, looking out at the peaceful street. "Yeah," I say, leaning my head back against her hand. "It is. We stay like that for a long time, just watching the world go by." I think about the question that drove me through all of this. How far will a man go to defend his own? I have my answer now. You go as far as you have to. You fight with fists. You fight with cameras. You fight with secrets and ledgers. You fight until your family is safe. I didn't want this war. I came here seeking peace. But I learned that peace isn't something you find. It's something you build. And sometimes, you have to be willing to burn down the old world to build a new one on the ashes. Looking at my wife, my daughter, and my home, I know without a single doubt that it was all worth it. The fight is over. We're safe. We're home. And this time, it's for good.